Welcome all. I'm very pleased today to be joined by the director of the Regional Studies Center, Mr. Richard Giragosian. So Richard Giragosian, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So as you all know, I want to talk about this US-facilitated talks that have been going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Secretary Blinken has mediated talks between the two sides twice so far. And the first time was a multi-day talks format, and after that there was a lot of hopes being stirred, especially after the State Department was saying that peace treaty is within reach, or there have been many positive developments. This time they spoke instead about the progress of the talks. Some people were mentioning that there was a change in tone or some interesting things with regards to wording between the aftermath of the two talks. So I'm wondering, was there a difference in your mind? Was there anything you found interesting about the language after the last meeting that took place in Washington?
That's a very good question. And in fact, I see significant differences, but also some interesting reflections. First, if we go back to the first meeting, it was 4 days of rather intensive introductory negotiations. The reason that was significant stems from two factors. First, it's been many, many years since we've had multi-day negotiations. This was not a one-time, one-off photo opportunity like we've been used to. The second key difference, it's also been many, many years since the U.S. has invested diplomatic capital in Armenia-Azerbaijani engagement. The last time I remember was in 2001 in Key West, Florida, which was even before 9/11. It was that long ago. What this shows is an American investment both in political and diplomatic capital, hence the personal involvement of the U.S. Secretary of State. Having said that, the second meeting was much more, let's say, realistic in terms of shorter, more focused, more concise, which is good. But I do think the initial optimism was dissipating in this second round. One observation, however, I do think the State Department and the American administration was disappointed. They expected more. And what's most interesting, they expected more from the Azerbaijani side. I do see early signs of the limits of American patience in terms of Azerbaijan's maximalist position has not softened. This is driving frustration in Washington. A second interesting aspect of this frustration is the timing. We saw the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry and the hardline elements in Baku try to sabotage the talks, undermining their own foreign minister by attacks and an artillery attack in particular that left 4 Nagorno-Karabakh soldiers dead. This was a serious, egregious violation of the spirit and intent of the talks. And finally, what we do see is a demonstration of the difference between Washington and Brussels. There is now a clear collaboration, but also division of labor. The Washington track is much more limited to the foreign ministers and limited to addressing bilateral interstate issues, much less about Nagorno-Karabakh. Moreover, it's supplemented by the national security advisors from both countries, Armen Giragosian from the National Security Council and Hikmet Hajiev from Azerbaijan, to bolster the foreign ministerial track. Brussels, however, again, it's facilitation, not mediation, but that's where President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan engage at the highest level, and that's where the discussion of Artsakh arises.
And are you saying that, you noted that the United States is investing more time and effort, one could argue, the most time and effort since Key West, which was a long time ago now. Could this be a sign of the US trying to assume a greater responsibility in the region? And on top of that, would you describe the way the South Caucasus today fits into the US's current foreign policy, priorities? Is it to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Armenia's democratization, or energy security, or something else?
Well, I would say, as much as I support the Biden administration as a Democrat, I am skeptical. Skeptical in terms of the South Caucasus is now very much in the U.S. national interest, but it's not a vital interest. And what we see is U.S. engagement, which is very high profile, very high visibility, but it's not sustainable over the longer term. Moreover, U.S. engagement is equally about Moscow as it is Yerevan or Baku. In other words, there is a vacuum where Russia remains distracted and overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine. So for the U.S., this is an opening, also about pushing back and perhaps pushing out Russian power and influence in the region. But a second element is also about democracy. And it's not about democracy promotion by the United States. It's democracy protection. This, therefore, is an embrace of Armenia in wake of 2 back-to-back free and fair elections and a much more democratic system of governance. So in this context, Armenia has the advantage, especially as Western engagement and American involvement is now increasingly frustrated by Azerbaijan's maximalist position and obvious deficit of democracy.
And I also want to get to your reaction to a comment made by the US ambassador to Armenia, Kristina Kvien, who was appointed not that long ago. She said in an interview on Armenian public radio that the US hopes and believes that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh can live under Azerbaijan. I'm wondering, what was your reaction to her comments?
Well, it was on public TV, not public radio. But Ambassador Kvien, who has greatly impressed many in terms of her former position as charge d'affaires in Kiev, is already surpassed expectations on the ground in Armenia. She is probably one of the most active Western ambassadors, and as U.S. ambassador, her commitment to visiting Sunik, going to the areas targeted by Azerbaijan, has reinforced a positive message that the U.S. is investing in the national security of Armenia. Her comments, however, are not surprising. She is a diplomat, and we should not necessarily be surprised of the diplomatic approach and language used. The spirit and environment of the bilateral negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan are based on certain premises. And I don't expect her to be able to be as honest or candid as one would. In other words, my frustration is not with her, but with the reaction to her statements. Because what we see is it may dangerously encourage Azerbaijan. And there is no hope for the future security or safety of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh under Azerbaijani rule. This is demonstrated by a tragic history. If we look at pogroms of Sumgait, Baku, Kirovabad, it's also reinforced by recent trends by Azerbaijan, which does little to inspire confidence. And finally, I would add, Azerbaijan is promising that the Armenians will have rights and civil liberties equal to that of the ordinary Azerbaijani citizen. That is preposterous, because the ordinary Azerbaijani citizen is living in a dictatorship with no rights of their own. It's the North Korea of the Caucasus. Therefore, there is no real justifiable optimism.
You spoke a bit about waning American patience, about greater U.S. engagement, about democracy protection. For our watchers, I mean, how would you describe Washington's leverage over Baku? Does it have significant leverage, and in what forms may it perhaps have leverage, in your opinion?
Well, let me answer with a question. What leverage? In other words, the United States has limited leverage over Azerbaijan for two reasons. One is the lack of democracy. And as we see in recent days, Azerbaijan is hosting a non-alignment summit of non-aligned nations. What does that say? Moreover, they are playing Ukraine off of Russia and trying, like Turkey, to balance in between without taking sides. But a second reason here is Azerbaijan has less leverage and less significance to the United States at the same time. The Azerbaijani government does not quite realize that the Pentagon is no longer interested in Azerbaijan. The American military withdrawal from Afghanistan overnight has downgraded Azerbaijan's strategic and geopolitical significance. This is perhaps why Azerbaijan is trying to play much more aggressive and assertive positions against Iran. But that is doomed to fail. This is not the Bush administration. There are no neocons left in Washington that would back Azerbaijan as an instrument to undermine Iran. So in this context, I think the European Union perhaps has more effective leverage. But at the end of the day, Azerbaijan is neither interested nor happy with talk about democracy or human rights from anywhere in the West.
Okay, and finally, Richard Giragosian, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the 2020 war, we would speak and hear often about the OSCE Minsk group, which was the negotiating format which attempted to negotiate between the two sides for many years and had three permanent co-chairs, Russia, the United States, and France. Now, in this period, we're seeing these three separate avenues, one in Brussels, one in Moscow, and one in Washington. I'm wondering, what do you think in hindsight about this kind of breaking of the negotiation format into three different formats? A lot of people who follow the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict find it rather confusing that there are these multi-negotiation formats. So, I mean, what is your opinion about that, about this in hindsight, the OSCE group being sort of defunct now?
Well, like everyone in Armenia, we're all historians to some degree. And in this context, the OSCE Minsk group is very much a footnote in history at this point and is done. The reason here is a reflection that the formation, the origins of the OSCE Minsk group were actually very much an accident of history and a result of an ad hoc reactive approach to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. What we see now, however, is post-2020 war more than Ukraine. And this is, I would say, a more primitive, but also more sophisticated effort at mediation or facilitation. Because the EU track is very much supported by the Washington meetings. And Russia's reaction is largely just that, a reaction. They've lost the diplomatic initiative. And Russia simply responds with a photo opportunity after every meeting in Brussels or Washington. Without that diplomatic initiative, I do think this is where we see Western engagement and involvement. But most importantly, unlike the Minsk group, which was only about Nagorno-Karabakh, the current diplomatic effort is only about Armenia-Azerbaijan. It's bilateral, interstate. That's the key difference. That's the main problem.
Okay, well, as always, Richard Giragosian, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.